Welcome everybody. Just a teeny tiny bit about myself. So yeah, I'm an associate director within the sustainability team based up in the north of England. In a previous life, I was involved quite significantly in a number of organisations that focused on procurement for social housing and also local authorities. So public contract regulations, compliance stuff. So in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, as it were. So I've kind of got the mantle of being the procurement guy for social housing Retrofit accelerator related stuff. So in terms of the agenda, it's not a prescriptive contents page. These are the broadly speaking the themes that I want to run through today. So it might seem a little bit obvious, but I think it's useful to initially reiterate what it is that we're talking about, what procurement actually is. So the first one, that top definition, that's from CIPS, the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. So basically, it means going out and securing the things that your organisation needs to sustain itself and or its operation. So when we're focusing on the public sector, however, there's an additional nuance to chuck into the mix, and that's this concept of MEAT, so most economically advantageous tender. So unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, there isn't a hard and fast rule as to what constitutes the most economically advantageous tender. So it all depends on the thing that you're buying, so the subject matter of the contract, the subject matter of the procurement, the stuff that's important to you as an organisation, so your aims, your objectives, and things of that nature. So broadly speaking, you'd be looking at how a procurement can contribute to the wider quality objectives that your organisation might have, so stuff like training, apprenticeships, local supply chain use, whole life costing, environmental impacts, all of those sorts of things. How can delivery of the contract and the appointment of the successful bidder support you in the achievement of this sort of stuff? So it's worth highlighting that although currently we talk about MEAT, most economically advantageous tender, there have recently been some changes to the procurement regulations announced, which get rid of the economic thing. We are now focused on, or we will be in 2023, so not really relevant for any procurement activity that you're undertaking right now, but we will be talking about the most advantageous tender. So it's a slight nuance, but again, it gives, in theory, the buying organisation more scope to focus on the qualitative side of things, the things that really matter to them. But following on from that, what is procurement? Let's have a look at some of the high-level principles of procurement. So again, we do also, I think, need to mention that procurement does have its limitations, and we'll touch on that in a second. There are things that must be taken into account when we're spending public cash. So broadly speaking, you'd look to procure via some form of competitive process. It's not always essential. So there are routes to market whereby you don't have to, ask for tenders back several times over and so on and so forth. And it doesn't always give you value for money, but we'll touch on that again slightly later on. But broadly speaking, yeah, you'd want to test cost and quality through some form of competitive process, and obviously you'd want to procure in a compliant fashion. So you want to stick with the rules. You don't want to break the law to buy what it is that you're buying. So when we're talking about social landlords and other public sector contracting authorities, so we have already got this value for money, this most economically advantageous tender concept. We've also got to follow best practice, and yes, of course, comply with the Public Contract Regulations 2015. So that's the regulations that we are still in force today that we'd have to follow. It dictates how we go to market, how we buy stuff, the things that you have to do as procuring organisations, how you can engage with suppliers of goods and services and such. All of this stuff is embedded in the PCR 2015, and it's not the most interesting of reads, but I think it's worth getting your heads around. Certainly when you're going to your procurement colleagues and saying, can we do this? And they say no, and here's why. At least you'd have an understanding as to why. You can't just give a contract to a supplier because they've helped you to develop your program, or you can't just go and say we want that particular product because we went on a golf day. You can't do that sort of stuff. And the Public Contract Regulations 2015 explains, it explains why sometimes procurement colleagues can be classed as barriers or just frustrating processes and such. They're not. They're following the law. So yeah, be aware of the PCR and its contents when you are engaging with supply chains. So the middle one, though, the demonstrate proprietary and good practice. So that, you know, relates to things like conflicts of interest, anti-corruption, bribery and fraud, and, you know, in a nutshell, ensuring that the decisions that you make following the procurement can step up to audit. You know, you are spending public money in a way that's not going to cause any grief or comeback or risk to you as a buying organisation. So we've talked about the public contract regulations. There's a lot of that, obviously the rules around procurement embedded within that particular piece of legislation. However, your landlord organisation, your local authority might have its own standing orders or, you know, internal procurement rules, which not only help them meet the procurement regulations, but also help them meet their own procurement priorities. So, you know, some organisations have a rule that if the contract's over a particular value, it's going to be advertised in the local and the regional press, for example, some you know, things that are specific to your organisation, which, yeah, again, you need to be aware of. All of these things, though, you know, with a little bit of creativity, a lot of the things that initially seem to be barriers or challenges, they can be overcome, but there are still some hard gates. There are still some things that you just cannot just do because you want to. So yeah, get your head around those. In terms of the 4 main types of procurement, there are some more, but, you know, currently the PCR 2015 talks about, you know, these kinds of procurement routes. There are others. I've mentioned, you know, stuff like innovation partnerships, but they're very, very niche and quite complicated and quite lengthy to deliver. So I'm not going to go into really any detail of on innovation partnerships at all. And given the tight delivery timescales that seem to come with public funding, certainly relating to energy efficiency, realistically speaking, as an organisation, you're probably going to be looking at the open procedure. I would have thought. If the value of procurement is over a particular threshold, you know, if you need 15 million quid's worth of stuff as opposed to £50,000 worth of stuff, you know, you will have your own, as mentioned earlier, you know, your own standing orders that say the process that you need to follow, or in line with the Public Contract Regulations 2015, you will have to tender in a particular way. But broadly speaking, time being what it is, open procedures, you know, the way that you will probably access procurement. Now, you'll only need to do that if you haven't got a contract already on board that can be modified, extended, or, you know, delivery of social housing decarbonisation fund schemes couldn't be appended to. So, you know, this is if you have to go to market. Now, you'll notice here I've not mentioned frameworks or procurement or dynamic purchasing systems, and I'm sure you'll heard of frameworks as a potential route to market for you. And that's, you know, for a specific reason. That they're a little bit different. That they're not in themselves are a type of procurement. They are effectively procured. A framework is procured using some of these particular routes to market. But again, with the view and the issue around timescales, frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems are probably going to be of real interest to you for delivery of your SHDF projects. So, spending a little bit more time looking at frameworks, there is a lot of talk about frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems when it comes to public procurement. But again, like most things, they can be both good and bad. So a well-managed and well-procured framework, you know, creativity was applied when the framework was set up. It can overcome a lot of the challenges and barriers that smaller organisations that want to get, you know, public contracts out of you guys seem to face. If they're not well managed, if they're not well procured, they can be the opposite. So let's assume we're talking about a good framework. You know, the things that make them good for buyers can still make them bad for contractors. So a small number of companies eligible to win work, that tends to sharpen the pencil on the part of those organisations that are on the framework. However, if you missed the tender, if you didn't get on that particular framework, you're excluded for quite some time, you know, upwards of 4 years. So good if you're on it, not great if you're not. From a time perspective, and again, delivery is critical to SHDF. It is possible that you can directly select a contractor, so you don't have to do an additional tender exercise or a mini competition. And there are pros and cons to both. There have been some recent direct awards that have actually delivered at outturn costs that are better value to the buyer than the rates that a mini competition would suggest would be delivered. When you've got a mini comp, all bets are off. Everybody sharpens their pencils again, and to an extent, a contractor can enter into a mini competition knowing that there's an option to, I don't know, vary some of the rates, add extra things. They can rate build post award, but with direct selection, it tends to be that can't happen because the direct selection rates might be a little bit more. But regardless, if you are looking at a framework that has the opportunity to directly select or mini comp, engage with that framework provider and get their views. They understand the contractors that are on the frameworks, or they should do if well managed, and would be able to provide a wealth of evidence around outturn costs from mini competition call-offs and directly selected call-offs as well. So yeah, they can be fast, they can be cheap, and this is an important one. Frameworks can build on the lessons learned from previous tenders. So a well-managed framework again could identify contractors identified or picked up on a slight ambiguity in the specification, and they made some hay with this one. Let's change the spec slightly, and let's stop a contractor from doing that. Equally, there might be some outcomes that were better following one client's requirements. A client specification was tweaked in a slightly different way, and that worked better or better value than another. The framework management organization can take the learning from other competitions and continually improve the specification, continually improve the engagement that they're having with their contractors to make sure that they're delivering best. So they aggregate knowledge as well as volume, and lower costs and lower rates for stuff. So a DPS, a dynamic purchasing system, is a bit different. So whereas a framework can be closed to new entrants, you're on it, good. You're not on it, you're knackered. A DPS is a bit different. So they never close effectively. So throughout the life of that dynamic purchasing system agreement, new entrants can, or new bidders can get onto that DPS and be in a chance of winning work for you. So you can have more competition via a DPS, but caveat emptor, we need to be aware that with increased competition, there is equally an increased amount of time required for evaluation. So you have a framework with 6 contractors on it. If all of those respond to your tender, you've got 6 bids to evaluate. A dynamic purchasing system with 25, 30, 40, you can't stop them. 50 contractors on. If everybody responds to your requirement or your opportunity, you've got 50 tenders that you would need to review. So the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. What seems to be great on the first hand in terms of competition can lead to lengthy and protracted tender evaluation processes on your part. The second big difference, I think, around frameworks and DPS is that with a framework, there is that opportunity for direct selection where you don't have to undertake another competition. With a DPS, you have to, in every single circumstance, run a competition. There's no direct award. You can't just say, I want them. You have to go to market, and you have to then evaluate what market responds with. There's a perception that DPS are good for smaller contractors, SMEs, that aren't as well experienced at tendering for public sector works. And to an extent, they are. To get on a DPS, it's relatively straightforward. You've just got to demonstrate you have the minimum entry requirements, you've got the qualification, or you deliver the services that will be required. There's not a lot of form filling in. However, because there is a need for competition every single time, if your small SME contractor that's got onto your DPS is dead happy because they didn't have to fill in a form, they will have to fill in those forms when they are responding to your tender requirement or your invitation to tender. So you can't get away from it. You've got to still put some time and effort into completing a quality submission and such. I think broadly speaking, DPS are very, very useful where we are talking about emerging markets or new products and services where things are changing day in, day out, new companies are coming on board and new products are being brought to market, where a framework would deliver of something very static and something that in 2 years' time would be outdated and not what the market needs. So a DPS is good for that, but over time it's likely that you'd probably want to deliver more of your works via frameworks. Underlined it again, if well managed, both a framework and a DPS can be used to aggregate knowledge, learning and best practice, as well as demand and volumes, which leads to, to price reductions and value tenders. Okay, so here's an example tender process. I'm not going to talk through this slide in any significant detail, but I wanted to illustrate, broadly speaking, what an organisation or an exercise might look like. So this is the restricted procedure. And if you recall from the earlier slide, a restricted procedure effectively is kind of like a two-stage tender. There's a pre-qualification questionnaire, you sort the wheat from the chaff, and then there's an invitation to tender, which only goes to those contractors or suppliers that have got through your pre-qualification questionnaire stage. So it's a two-stage tender. But regardless of that, and regardless ultimately of any route to market that you go through, there are a whole host of these stages that you'll need to do. So, defining the requirement, the engagement at the front end, that's where you are refining what it is that you want. Is it the right solution? Have you considered the views of the groups, the other teams within your organization that will be impacted upon by the thing that's being bought? You might be a specifier, but have you run it past the end users? Have you run it past the maintenance teams? Have you run it past your housing team that has to engage with the tenants that are going to be using this stuff once you've installed it? So there's all of this stuff at the front end. You still need all of these stages. You need to define the requirement, you need to form that procurement team, you need to make sure that market can respond, and then you need to get into the guts of developing that tender documentation, whether it's a PQQ then ITT, or whether it's just an ITT in an open procedure, or just an ITT if it's a framework. You've still got to do all of that stuff at the front end, regardless of the route that you finally choose. Equally, not going to go into significant amounts of detail on this slide. It's there for you to read. And again, regardless of the route to market, these are skills that will be required within your procurement team. And dependent on the route to market that you choose, some things become slightly more important than others. In an old school, graphic equalizer or hi-fi setup, you could increase the bass a little bit, drop the treble. You're doing that with skill sets potentially dependent on, the final route to market that you use. However, I think there are two, hence the little green boxes, there are two areas that really get overlooked and really you need to double down on, regardless of what or how you're procuring or how you plan to deliver your quality objectives. So the first one is that stakeholder management. That's the front end activity. So really getting a handle on what it is that you're going to market for, making sure that it's deliverable, that it's the right solution, that yes, your maintenance team, your tenants, your housing team, your finance bods, all of these people, anyone ultimately that's impacted upon by the thing that's being bought needs to have fed into the development of that specification in some way. So at the front end, you've got to have all that stakeholder management on board, and equally you need that stakeholder management throughout the delivery of the project to avoid confusion, conflict and challenge as you're going along. And the second one, which is frequently overlooked, is contract management. And that kind of ties back to this concept of, if you're asking for all this really good stuff, this social value, this added value, this meaty stuff, the economically advantageous tender activities, these kind of issues, if you're asking for the moon on a stick, but you don't check that contractors or suppliers are actually delivering for you, or you're not able to identify when they're not and then sanction them or reward them if they are doing it, what's the point of asking for all this stuff in the first place? If contract management drops, contractors can write whatever they want in a tender, they can score really highly, and you might be awarding a contract to the wrong contractor ultimately. If someone can talk a good talk but then ultimately doesn't deliver on that aspect, and if you're not bothered about it, it kind of sticks in the craw a little bit. So if you are going to ask for all these added value things, if you are going to manage and monitor costs and KPIs and performance and so on and so forth, if you're asking for these kinds of questions, you've got to follow up on it. You've got to do it. Lack of contract management is an area where significant added value often gets lost in the procurement process. You think you've done it because you've awarded the contract. You've not. The procurement process continues to an extent. In relation to contract management, that's also an area where frameworks can help to an extent. So you can understand, for example, if a contractor was obliged to deliver, I don't know, 2 apprentices on your contract, and in every other regard they were really, really, really performing well. They were on time, they were on cost, quality was dead high. You might not, understandably, want to boot them off the contract because they've not done this thing for you. And there are, examples of where contract clauses can be, what's the word, amended, agreed. Yeah, you might not go through with it. So if, for example, the framework through which you procured that contractor, if apprentices was really important to them, though, they can have words with that contracting organisation. They can remind them, you're not doing what you should be doing in line with this framework agreement. We're not happy about this. We might stop you from tendering for future opportunities until you sort this out. They can be almost like the bad cop to your good cop in some cases. But again, it depends on the framework management organisation that you're working with. In terms of some of the key documents, it might be a little bit obvious, but again, I think it's worth reiterating just what some of these things are. And all of this stuff, all of it, ideally needs to be boxed off before you go to market. Don't try and develop some of this stuff once the tender's live or on the fly. It'll all end pretty badly ultimately. It's the sort of stuff that you would address as part of that stakeholder engagement stage. So your invitation to tenders, they need to be clear. They need to provide as much info as possible about what it is that you're going to market for. It's got to reference any wider objective that you might have that you would expect the contractor to deliver through for you. It's the mechanics of the procurement documentation. These are the processes that we'll follow, and this is what we want from you. It's a seller's market, I think it's fair to say. Everyone's going to market for the same stuff at the same time in relation to energy efficiency. Contractors will be able to pick and choose. They will either pick and choose those contracts that are more straightforward to them, the ones that are clearly defined, that they understand what they've got to come back with, i.e. ones that really respond to that ITT point very well, or, and this is the slightly cynical version, they will go for those undefined ones because they know they can make a shed load of cash out of it, because they can put claims in, they can rate build. If it's clear that the client doesn't understand what it is that they want to procure, okay, that's opportunity in the eyes of some contracting organisations. So in both cases, we need to box off the ITT stuff. In relation to the quality questions, they need to be specific. They need to relate to your project and your aims and objectives. So yeah, generic questions deliver generic responses. And no matter how glossy or polished the contractor submission is, it'll be meaningless when you try to identify what that bidder, what that contractor is going to do specifically for you and specifically on that project. You won't be able to identify it. Likewise, if you're going to ask for something, weight it appropriately. So we've already talked about the moon on the stick in relation to contractor management. Again, if you put, 50%, if you ask for shed loads of stuff on apprenticeships or social value or local supply chain and then weight it to 2% of your overall submission, again, you're not going to get anything like a meaningful response from market in relation to that. They're not going to waste their time and effort on a question when they can actually focus on another area of their tender submission and secure better value. They're quite cynical in that respect. If you set the quality questions up correctly, the responses that contractors provide can then be used to inform the ongoing contractor and performance management framework for the project. Asking the contractors, what will you deliver in terms of apprenticeships on this contract? What will you deliver in terms of time in properties and so on and so forth? Get them to give the contractors enough rope to hang themselves with when it comes to contractor management and framework management. Post award, you said you were going to do this, so go ahead and do it now. But you can only do that if the questions are clear and elicit that kind of response. Specs, very quickly, they're not just for things, so you can specify behaviours as well. Performance-based outcomes are useful. So again, if, for example, heating systems, if you say we want a minimum seasonal performance factor of 3.2 at 55-degree flow, that allows the bidders to bring their innovation, their experience and their knowledge to the potential opportunity. You're not having to get into the nuts and bolts of specifically saying, I want this product and that product, and I want this many screws and so on and so forth. Let market respond to that. However, if there are things that you do need and you would require, stuff like copper pipe in a heating system, you can specify that and clearly state that, yes, I don't want push fit, I don't want plastic, I want copper. But how you design the thing, as long as it comes up with that SPF of 3.2, off you go. Commercial documents, they should be sufficiently granular to give you the tools to manage the contract going forward, but not so granular that no contractor wants to fill them in. Looking at split between materials and labour in a rising market is quite useful. If a contractor turns around and says, we can't do this job for this money anymore because the price of, I don't know, widgets has gone up. Okay, what was the original price that you put in for widgets? And let's talk about that. If you've got that up front, you can have those serious and sensible conversations. If you haven't, you're a bit in the dark. And lastly, the form of contract should be tailored to the project that you are delivering, and it should clearly list any penalties that are going to be applied for non-delivery of wider outcomes or just non-delivery of the contract itself. Be clear. Those are the key documents. Right, getting it right. So again, this just reiterates everything that we said before. So I won't go through this with any real effort, with the exception of number 7, I think. And this is useful to challenge yourselves. So, be realistic with yourselves. Can you deliver what you want to deliver in terms of the procurement access in the time that you've allocated? What happens if there's a delay? What if 2 of your procurement team go on holiday halfway through? We really need to be aware of the timescales that we are putting into our procurement processes, and being aware equally that there are hiccups from time to time. So yeah, number 7, be realistic. That's the important one. So yeah, post Brexit, I'm going to touch very briefly on this one. In a nutshell, don't expect too much of a significant change. So coming in 2023 are the new rules and regulations. Value for money, that's still there. Transparency, that's still there. Integrity, everything that's enshrined within the current set of rules and regulations is in the new one as well. Where we have to advertise tenders is a little bit different. We're not talking OJU anymore. We're talking governments find a tender service. We're talking most advantageous tender, not most economically advantageous tender. So the names have changed to protect the innocent, but broadly speaking, it's pretty much the same sort of stuff. Effectively, they've defined different routes to market. So those procedures that we talked about earlier, they're a little bit different. But for the purposes of SHDF Wave 1, and to an extent, many cases of Wave 2, if we're getting ahead of the game, it's the current rules and regulations that apply. So engage with your procurement teams, and they'll probably be able to give you a better potted summary than I could. Very lastly, sustainable procurement. This is cropped up time and time again. So relatively, perhaps controversially, sustainable procurement isn't something different. It's not a thing in its own right. Sustainable procurement is just good procurement. Nobody goes out to procure unsustainably. That would be ridiculous. Nobody goes out to procure in such a way that impacts negatively on the lives of people operating in their supply chains. Bonkers. It's just good procurement. So start with your policy. You might have one already. If you haven't, go and develop one as an organisation, but don't go searching Google. So engage with your colleagues and make sure that what is developed is relevant to you as an organisation and your wider organisational objectives. Engagement, I've said it throughout this presentation, be consistent at least, and I am being. Engage. Anyone that is involved in the procurement decision, is impacted upon it, they need to be involved, and that does involve your customers, tenants as well. Now, the sustainable supply, this is a bit of an interesting one. We want suppliers and contractors to support your objectives. So it's great that they're doing stuff on, I don't know, baby seal protection and all this kind of stuff. However, if your real interest is water quality and water pollution, them stopping baby seals, I don't know why I've gone down that dark route. You get where I'm coming from. If the focus isn't your focus, they're not actually supporting you achieve your objectives in relation to water pollution. You want them to support you to address the things that matter to you. So ensure that your suppliers support your objectives, as well as having their own really good and laudable things that they want to focus on as well. Prioritize. So yeah, rather than just hitting everything at once and not getting very far or focusing on the wrong things, potentially, you need to understand within your supply chain where the your big sustainability issues are lying and lurking. So yeah, don't spend time and effort focusing on your widget supplier if it's your grommet manufacturer that's got your, the biggest carbon footprint, or going back to our water pollution idea, is hideously polluting your local rivers and streams. Focus your efforts on those suppliers and contractors on those areas of your supply chain that impact most in relation to your objectives. So in terms of encouraging supply chain, it's in your interest to improve the quality of your supply chain. So if, for example, you had 5 or 6 suppliers that were on one of your frameworks or on your books that you use quite frequently, and if you started to focus a bit more on environmental performance, for example, and one of those contractors was head and shoulders above the others, and they got complacent, so they could increase their rates because they knew that they were the only ones that were going to get the work, because they're the only ones that are any good at this particular issue. Supporting the other contractors that you work with, or suppliers that you work with, to not be on a par but improve their environmental performance, means that the next time you went to market for a product or a service, it might well be more than one that is in a chance of winning. That can deliver ultimately a better value outcome for you. Spending a bit of time and effort on improving your supply chain can result in a more economically advantageous outcome from any procurement activity that you deliver. Oh, and equally support your own procurement staff, of course, on upskilling people internally. And lastly, do what you say you'll do. People will take notice and they will respond, and they will respect you for that as well. And if we do all of this right, you'll have significant added value from your contracts. Your suppliers themselves will improve their performance in relation to sustainability, and will have got rid of some really nasty stuff that's been lurking in supply chains for some time. And that's it. Thank you very much.